Teo had been in the police station for 6 hours before he realized he wasn't really there to help. He had found his neighbor, Mrs. Coker, dead in her flat and called the police immediately. They kept telling him he wasn't under arrest, that he was there voluntarily, but the door never seemed to stay open long enough for him to leave. He sat back down every time they asked. He had been raised to believe that the truth was a sufficient defense, and that innocent people had no reason to withhold cooperation. He answered every question about the pot he borrowed and the state of the door, unaware that his helpfulness was being catalogued as evidence. Inspector Akin, the lead detective, maintained a disarming warmth. He offered water and used Teo's first name, leaning back in his chair as if they were just two neighbors sorting out a misunderstanding. But as the hours dragged on, Teo felt a familiar, sharp pressure behind his eyes, the same headache that had been bothering him for weeks. Teo's absolute faith in the truth had become his primary vulnerability. By handing over every detail of his life without a lawyer, he provided the raw materials for a narrative he didn't control. He was giving the police a map, and they were already looking for a way to lead it back to him. Akin began by prying at the smallest cracks in Teo's memory. When Teo mentioned borrowing a pot 2 weeks ago, Akin pointed out that Mrs. Coker's daughter remembered it happening a month ago. It was a minor discrepancy, but in the heat of a windowless room, it felt like the beginning of a lie. Then came the physical evidence. Akin produced a grainy still from a security camera outside the apartment building. The figure in the dark hoodie was a shadow with no face, but the timestamp placed him at the scene the night before the murder. The interrogation took a darker turn when Akin played a recording of an argument from Mrs. Coker's apartment. Through the static, Teo heard a voice that made his blood turn cold. It sounded like his brother, Kunle, a man who had been missing for 8 months. As Teo struggled to process the recording, Akin leaned in closer. He didn't accuse Teo, he simply asked if there were things Teo was afraid to remember. For a second, Teo thought about the strange gaps in his recent memory, the hours he couldn't account for, and the sudden, unexplained fatigue. By ignoring Teo's consistent alibis and fixating on these unexplainable fragments, Akin was systematically eroding Teo's confidence. The interrogation was no longer about discovering what happened to Mrs. Coker. It was about convincing Teo that he could no longer trust his own mind. When Akin finally let him go, the drive home felt like a descent into paranoia. The rhythmic lights of the street lamps felt like a countdown, and every shadowed alleyway looked like a figure waiting for him to pass. He entered his apartment and stopped dead. The kitchen light was on. He lived alone, and he knew with absolute certainty that he had turned it off before leaving for the station. On the counters sat a dusty, unlabeled cassette tape, placed right next to a cassette player that had been pulled out of storage and plugged in. Someone had been inside his home while he was trapped in the interrogation room. The presence of the tape proved that his front door was no longer a barrier. While he was busy being helpful to Inspector Akin, his private sanctuary had been accessed and staged, turning his home into an extension of the police station. Teo pressed play, and the voice of Mrs. Coker filled the room. She sounded breathless and frightened. She spoke directly to Teo, revealing that his brother Kunle had come to her months ago to hide a flash drive. The drive contained a digital ledger of corruption. This diagram shows the network Kunle had discovered, a web of systemic bribes and illicit payments that connected high-ranking officers to local criminal activity. Mrs. Coker had been keeping the evidence that could bring down the entire precinct. Then, the recording captured the sound of 3 slow, heavy knocks. Mrs. Coker gasped. The tape caught the sound of her door opening and the heavy footsteps of someone entering her apartment. A man's voice demanded the drive. Teo felt a wave of nausea as he recognized the speaker. It was his own voice, slurred and halting, but unmistakably his, recorded inside Mrs. Coker's flat on the night of the murder. The evidence was impossible to ignore. Teo was listening to a recording of himself committing a crime he had no memory of. The missing hours he had dismissed as stress were now documented proof of his presence at a murder scene. The tape didn't end with Teo's voice. A second man spoke, his tone cold and clinical as he ordered a search of the apartment. It was Inspector Akin. He wasn't investigating the scene, he was directing it. This timeline reveals the pattern Teo missed. His blackouts and headaches occurred immediately after friendly visits from Inspector Akin. The chemical markers were side effects of being drugged. Akin manipulated him, leading police directly to the hidden evidence. Tayo hadn't just been framed after the fact, he had been weaponized. Akin had transformed an innocent man into an unwitting accomplice, using Tayo's own body to find and silence the woman who held the truth. The cassette reached the end of the reel and clicked shut, leaving Tayo in a silence so heavy it felt physical. The realization of what he had been forced to do made the room feel smaller, the shadows longer. Then the silence was broken by 3 slow, rhythmic knocks on his actual front door. They were identical to the knocks he had just heard on the recording. Inspector Akin's voice came through the door, pleasant as ever, stating they needed to talk. Outside, the door handle began to turn. Every honest answer Tayo had given at the station was now the final piece of the trap. He had provided the police with everything they needed to ensure he would never tell his story. His cooperation hadn't been his salvation, it was the map to his own undoing.